Thank you for joining us. Professor Lawrence Lowe is the director of the Center for CGIO, Governance, Institutions and Organizations, and we'll hear from him shortly. I am your warm-up act, if you want to think of it that way, and I'd like to get this discussion going. We'd like it to be as interactive as possible, so please put in your questions live, and as and when we see them, we'll try and answer as many of those as possible. So let's get straight into the topic. And I have two immediate challenges as I start my piece. Firstly, I really don't know who my audience is, so I'll have to make some guesses and hope that I can get the pitch right. And secondly, the topic governance. Governance can mean many things to many people. And I wonder what you think of when you hear the word governance. I think of oversight. So physically, if you think about the view from up above, whether it's from the ceiling of your room or the view from outer space, if you're talking about global governance. So oversight, safeguarding is another word that comes to mind, stewardship, trusteeship, monitoring, all of these are associated with governance. Governance relates to a bundle of processes, institutions, roles, and norms that ensure the smooth functioning of a system, whatever that system is. You may want to think of the road traffic system outside or air traffic system. How do we ensure that traffic flows smoothly? What are the actions that are taken before things get started? What actions are taken when there are specific situations? If there's an accident, if there is congestion during peak hours, for example. Some of these are predictable, some of them are more difficult to anticipate, and some of these can be completely black swan events, as the metaphor goes. And so governance relates to the rules and the norms, and some of these norms are explicit, some of them are implicit, the boundaries and the guardrails, together with tools and processes within which the smooth functioning of the system is assured. And then it's the job of the executive, the management and the operating units to function within the boundaries and guardrails that are set by governance. Some forms of governance are tightly defined. They may be enforceable by law, and then some others that are more loose, that are norms of behavior that may be cultural, that may be historical, that may depend on the lived experience of participants who then acquire beliefs in a certain way. So the law may not require you, if you're driving on the roads, to thank the car that lets you cut into to change lanes and go to the other lane. But you may still do so because you may have the belief that through reciprocity, it ultimately creates a better system. So that form of governance is more networked, it's less vertical, it's more by enforcement, it's more by agreement rather than enforcement. I also use the word system in very general terms. It could be very large parts of society, or it could be our local football club. And so there are layers of governance. There's global governance, there's public sector governance, there is internet or cyber governance, there's health governance, which is very much in the spotlight right now, and there's corporate governance. And Professor Lowe will speak about some of these big picture terms. I wanted to focus on corporation, on the economics and the field of private companies. And let me pretend that you, the audience, are members of a corporate board. You could be non-executive directors on the board, or you could be advisors to corporate boards. And my main conclusion, let me put it out there straight away, is that I think that COVID-19, the tragic crisis that we're going through right now, is going to act as an accelerant, as a booster for stakeholder capitalism. And board governance will have to play a key role in that. We are in a novel situation, which will require a novel role for company boards. So what do we mean by stakeholder capitalism? If you go to last year, in August of 2019, The Business Roundtable in the US, 181 of the largest CEOs, they came together and they issued a path-breaking declaration that said that the purpose of a corporation is not just to serve shareholders, but to serve all stakeholders. It's a huge departure from the previous attitude that the shareholder is supreme. And what do we mean by stakeholders? Well, it's basically everyone that has a hand in getting to corporate results and everyone who is impacted by corporate actions. So that's employees, that's suppliers, customers, the local community within which you operate, and the government in the land that you operate in. So that declaration got everyone excited. A month later, the UN convened, and more and more companies pledged to support the UN Sustainable Development Goals. The OECD came together and did something similar. They came up with the Business for Inclusive Growth, B4IG. More CEOs pledged that they're going to combat inequalities. 130 banks came together and they set up the principles for responsible banking, which incorporates both the SDGs and also the Paris Climate Agreements. And it dovetails what already existed, which is the principles for responsible investing, that investments that half the assets under management in the world had already signed up to. And that is the mood that prevailed into January, going into the World Economic Forum's annual meeting in Davos, where there was a lot of rhetoric, both companies and investors almost falling over each other to demonstrate that they are, at least in principle, proponents of stakeholder capitalism. Now, look, practically, what does it mean, stakeholder capitalism? At least three things. Firstly, it's taking a systems approach to value creation. It's acknowledging that in order to both create value and to build risk resilience, there are multiple constituents that contribute to both of these. And so a board's fiduciary duty is not only just to shareholders, but to stakeholders at large. And once you move away from the extreme short term, there is actually a convergence of interest between not just shareholders' interests, but stakeholder considerations. So there should be no fiduciary conflict. So that's number one. Number two, every company should have a purpose statement that connects the way it makes profit to its impact on society. So purpose linking profit to society. And then thirdly, it should mean that at a board level, there should be representation from stakeholders. So employee representation on the boards in the way that you have in Germany or in Netherlands, for example. So in January, it was mostly about climate change, and Greta Thunberg, if you remember, was very much on the stage. And investors were very keen when they looked at companies to talk about their ESG ratings. I sit on the investment committee of an endowment, and for us, it became very clear that companies that have high ESG ratings were also performing better, mainly because of the G, the governance part of ESG ratings. And so we were keen to see more disclosure, more transparency, because we don't want to be confronted with a situation where a company is storing contingent liabilities. So these are negative impact on the community or the environment that could come back to bite us later on. So I felt there was a genuine search and there was a genuine intention to look for metrics in a way that firms can signal their intention to go for stakeholder capitalism, but there was a gap. And one of the major consulting firms did a survey of about 1,000 CEOs, and it basically showed that 80% of them wanted to do more to support the SDGs, for example, but only 20% of them believe that they're actually doing much. The huge gap, 80-20 gap between the willingness to do and the actual doing of that. And the gaps the obstacles that were cited, oh, look, we have to go for efficiency and cost cutting and return on equity. And so we don't really have time for other considerations. Or life is too competitive. And if I try to do things differently here, my competitor might do things differently. or they might relocate out of London, go to Hong Kong, or go somewhere else where rules might be different. I really don't want to collaborate with my competitors. I mean, what do you mean by us having to come up with industry level response? Do I really have to collaborate with our cutthroat competitors? And then finally, there was still reluctance to believe that there is any corporate interest in trying to address very general topics of inequality or skills shortage at a society level. And my contention is that in a post-COVID world, I believe that all of these obstacles become lower, which is why my belief that I think the action from here on is that we'll see more movement towards stakeholder capitalism. I wrote an article last week that I will not go into, but it's called 9 Taboos of Macroeconomic Management Overturned by COVID-19. And it's that macroeconomic context that provides, or the macroeconomic background that provides the microeconomic context that companies operate in. So first of all, what about the drive for cost-cutting efficiency? Well, if you look around now, there is more of a realization that when you super optimize and you go for extreme efficiency without any redundancy or optionality or duplication in the system, you get supply chains that can break very easily when there's a structural shock. So there is more of a realization now that maybe a bit of inefficiency is not a bad thing. Secondly, what about the competitive pressure? What if a company leaves one jurisdiction and goes to another jurisdiction? Because in one jurisdiction, they're required or they're expected to look after stakeholders, whereas in another jurisdiction, they can only cater to the shareholder. Well, again, with a global pandemic, jurisdictional arbitrage internationally is less likely. How about the point, can I collaborate and coordinate? Well, look at Apple and Google. Even Apple and Google are now collaborating on contact tracing. Or I read about, is it GlaxoSmithKline and Sanofi, drug makers collaborating to create vaccines. Medtronics has put its design for ventilators on open source on the website. And I read about a company in Bangladesh having taken that and created, is manufacturing ventilators domestically. And actually, even in January, there were little green shoots of collaboration already happening. I learned that Colgate came up with an environmentally sustainable toothpaste tube, and they were sharing that technology with Unilever because they wanted the industry to become more environmentally friendly. So collaboration, I think, is on a different path and can go on a different path from here on. And then finally, on that issue of should companies care about general inequality issues, the general social issues, there's at least 2 reasons why companies should care about it even more now. Firstly, regulators and governments are expecting you to do more, particularly if you are benefiting from government bailouts. In the UK, the Bank of England wrote to the major banks and said that we expect you to not pay any dividends this year. Definitely no share buybacks, because you need to preserve capital while you're taking assistance from the government. And even if you're not taking assistance from the government, you're benefiting from stabilization of the system. And then secondly, if you purely think about it from an economics point of view, Economics 101 says that an economy is a circular flow of income. So my supply needs to meet with your demand. And in a world of extreme inequality, in a world where unemployment rate can go from 4% to 14% in 6 weeks, where is the demand going to come from for my products? And that is why many countries now are entertaining things like universal basic income, because you need to deliver cash to people that have a propensity to spend in order to create that velocity in the economy. So I'm going to stop here. I'm just going to stop with a last comment about board members, because as I said, I'm pretending that you are a board. So my call to action is that you should be doing 2 things right now. You should be doing a sweep of risks, and you should be doing a sweep of stakeholders. By sweep of risks, I mean go through the operational risks that the company is exposed to right now. from a business continuity point of view, from a going concern point of view, from a supply chain point of view, from a cyber attacks point of view, compliance, conduct issues around remote working, and so on and so forth. So you need to get on top of the whole sweep of risks, and you need to get a sweep of all the stakeholders to see how your actions are impacting each one of your stakeholders, both in terms of your immediate action and in terms of the longer run restructuring plans that you might have already, so that you're optimizing for the whole lot and not just for the shareholder. This is the time when relationship capital will be worth more than financial capital. So I'm going to stop here and pass you on to Professor Lowe.
I'd like to catch your attention today to talk about the pandemic test for corporate governance. I think Lutfey has touched on the economic corporate dimension. What I will do is to touch on the social, political, institutional dimension. And I think COVID-19 has been pretty much in the news over the last few months. The world just went past 4 million cumulative cases over the weekend. I think since January 22nd, it took about 2 months to reach the first million. And in less than 2 weeks after that, it reached the second million. And now we are achieving about 1 million in every 2 weeks. US alone has 1.3 million, Singapore 20,000. So I think, this is something that is very, I would say many people are very concerned about it, including the businesses, the industries, the ABC industry, from Airbus to Airbnb, for us in Singapore, from barbers to bubble teas, from clubs to cruises, A to Z, from aviation to zoos. It's going to impact so many of us from so many angles, not only from the public health and the medical responses, but from the industries and the companies, as Lutfey has mentioned. I believe the most fundamental factor is actually governance, which is actually a very complex, multifaceted construct that operates at different levels. So I touch on many of these levels in my 10 minutes of talk. International level, national level, and organizational level. And I think Professor Lutfey has talked about what is governance. I actually conduct a 4-day module in my EMBA class just on governance. It's a 4-day intensive residential module, but I will try to summarize 4 days into 4 seconds now. When certain individuals or organizations are empowered by stakeholders to take decisions. In other words, you own certain resources, you empower someone else to make certain decisions that will affect you. And I think today I would just want to do 3 tests on governance. And I'll just say the 3 things first. We'll look at the issue of context. Number 2, the issue of concept. And number 3, the issue of conduct. So let's look at the issue of context of governance first. For COVID-19, I believe in the issue of context, the landscape of COVID-19 is very, very interesting. Since I believe the first recorded case, I think there's a lot of debate on this in itself, whether it's 1st December, whether it's November 17th, or whether it exists from somewhere else in Wuhan from certain activities, or even in the lab. But I think we'll come to that in the Q&A to talk about the origin. But just to look at the context, even though the first reported case was in Wuhan, in fact, the city of Wuhan went into a lockdown on 23rd January. When I saw the news, it was something very unbelievable. How can such a big city, Wuhan, 11 million in population, compared to New York City, just over 8 million, and London, where Lutfey stays, about 9 million, 11 million got locked down, and China became, for the first 1 to 2 months, has a lot of COVID cases spreading not only in Wuhan, but to the province of Hubei and to the rest of the country. But now, fast forward, 10 countries has, surpassed China now. In fact, the US is on top of the leaderboard. 1.3, 1.4 million cases. China practically contained. If you look at Korea, if you look at Hong Kong, look at Taiwan, they are pretty much quite contained. In the Singapore case, for the local community, it's very well contained, except for the unsuspected dormitory case, which later on we want to ask in the Q&A. And in fact, you look at countries like Vietnam, it literally punched above its weight. So the first test that I want to talk about, the test of context, is this. Is there the East-West distinction in the ability to respond to COVID-19? In other words, the first question is more to do with culture and attitudes. The question is Western self-governance compared to the East and the West. I think there's a lot of debate on this. Later on, maybe some questions will come up. Number two is beyond the context. Let me talk about the concept of governance. And the concept, as I earlier said, it is basically who decides who decides. In other words, where decisions are made. Democracy as an institution. So, the role of democracy, particularly liberal democracy, is something that, we want to look at. And I think if you look at many of the responses in many regimes now, there seems to be a tension between democracy and also ability to, contain COVID-19. Again, it's a very sensitive topic, I must say, and there's no doubt that there are a lot of people who stand on both sides of the question. But so the pandemic test number 2 is this: has democracy-based governance failed? This is the second question of failure. And I think, let me touch on to the third question, whether pandemic test has failed. This is beyond the context. Number 2, concept. Number 3 will be conduct. So number 3 is we are talking about how governance is operationalized. How is it being put in practical terms? And you can see this is something that is structural. Many of you are probably watching how countries, governments perform, how even a international supranational body like WHO, I believe you know as WHO, who is that? World Health Organization is a specialized agency of the United Nations, and I think the Director General Tedros Adhanom has been in the limelight a lot recently. Whether this as an institution, as a structure, has been effective, and whether countries, governments, including US, UK, Western Europe, Asia, Singapore, whether some of these institutional structures have been effective in containing COVID. So the pandemic test number 3 is this. The key question is, for conduct, has global and I would say national institutional governance failed? So let me, beyond the 3 pandemic tests of context, concept, and conduct, let me just conclude by saying that, now it seems that the focus is actually trying to play this blame game, which is also an area of governance. Where does the responsibility lie? In fact, I think there's a battle going on now. Where is patient zero? And where does patient zero get the virus from? Is it the bat? Is it the snake? Or is it the cat like civet? The civet cat is actually also present in, I believe, Singapore. It's called the musang in Malay. So, and of course, you can see many, leaders, including the top leaders in the USA, have saying that, this virus may have started off, as reported in the media, in a lab in Wuhan, the virology lab near the wholesale market. So I think it's a battle of the bad and the lab going on now. I don't think, in my opinion, this is a useful way of spending our time and resources. Maybe you look at it in this way. You have a problem. Let's say you are flying in a plane now, and the aeroplane is in trouble. Should you be quarreling over where you came from? Where did the aeroplane come from? I think you should be more concerned about where are you going to land if you ever land? So I think in conclusion, let me just end by one statement for COVID-19. How it ends is more important than how it starts. So I believe this will be one of the fundamental principles of governance. We should be looking at the end in mind. How it ends is more important than how it starts. So on this note, let me end my preamble and pass it to the audience. I think Lutfey and I have to coordinate the questions. They're all coming in by the chat box. Professor Loh, do you think this COVID-19 will delay the process of reaching the SDGs, which is the sustainability development goals, or will it serve as a wake-up call to speed up SDG? In fact, I think one of the good thing about the virus, of course, it's nothing good, is over the last 2 months, the carbon emission has been quite low, in fact, almost zero in many places. In fact, I think, if anything, from the environmental side, I think COVID-19 is definitely a kick in the pants for us. It might be something that we have not been doing for the last many decades, that in a few months we are going to, atone for what we have done in the environment. So in as far as the SDG is concerned, there are, I believe, 17 of them, ranging from no poverty, zero hunger, all the way to diversity, gender diversity. I believe the COVID-19 squarely put all the issues onto the plate now. You can see in many countries now that it shows up in the raw, many tensions in terms of social, economic stratification. For example, home-based learning. Some people may have lived in posh bungalows. They have 17 rooms at home to do home-based learning, and you can see in some homes they have 7 people sharing one room to do home-based learning. So I think it shows up, and of course in the Singapore context, the recent debate and some of the difficulties in managing workers from different communities, particularly the migrant community, has been put onto the limelight. So I think it's something that is very useful for all of us.
I agree with you. I think there's an impetus to do more. It should help focus the mind, but at the same time, the starting point has been pushed back in many cases. Levels of poverty, people below the poverty line, unfortunately, more have gone backwards now because of what's happening right now. So the starting line is challenged, but hopefully the imperative for action will be stronger. There was a question about how would investors look at investments differently. One thing that's becoming very clear is that we will require resilience reports from companies to a much greater extent than has been in the past. And it's not so much a risk register that says, this is the risk and these are the mitigants and this is the risk. It's more about, well, what if the unknown happens? Whatever the flapping of the butterfly, if there were to be exogenous shocks, are you able to withstand them? And once you start thinking about systemic shocks, then perhaps climate change, which has for years struggled to come into the mainstream dialogue, may be also brought very much squarely into it. So ESG considerations, environmental, social, and governance issues, I would think would come a lot more into the mainstream when we talk about the viability of an investment, because the economic viability is directly related now to the sustainability of that investment from a risk and externality point of view. There was a question about, is all of this too aspirational at a time when companies are struggling with their bread and butter issues? And I think that is a valid question to ask. Clearly, at the moment, in the heat of the moment, the last thing you want to be doing is launching a new diversity initiative in the company when you're firefighting right now. And that I understand. And the Bank of England, I believe last week, issued a circular saying to banks that the climate-related stress test that they were ordered to do earlier on can now be suspended until the middle of next year. But they made it very clear it's not because we don't think it's important, but we think that you should be focusing on more immediate issues right now. And so you have another year before you publish those stress tests. And so I think it's a valid question to ask. My point is that the moment you get away from the immediate response and relief phase of our reaction to the pandemic, and you start going to the other side, which is recovery and reshaping of the economy, I don't think there is another way of approaching that side of things without thinking about more inclusive factors, because you will need to help generate demand in the economy, and you will need to help with a lot of the more structural issues. That's where the expectations will be. And then purely from an investment point of view, where will you put your money? Interest rates are zero or negative everywhere in the world. The quantity of cash has been increased through quantitative easing in a dramatic manner. There is a small pool of existing assets that I believe are in bubble territory. You have a small number of platform companies that are doing well. Everyone else is doing badly. I believe we will see a lot more asset destruction, because whenever you suspend an economy and you create a dent on earnings, that has to be impacted in some balance sheet somewhere. In all of that, you've got to ask, where will you put your money? And so I think a lot of new assets that need to be created that will attract capital are in the space of impact investing, green investing, social bonds, and so on and so forth.
Let's say on country responses and economic support, there was synthesizing a few questions there. There's one on how effective some of the support that governments given to business entities. How do we evaluate some of these new incentives that's given to business entities? And I think this trend comes about in several questions. So maybe let me say something before I pass to Siddiqi. I believe this COVID-19 is definitely unprecedented. In fact, if anything, I think it will clearly lead to not only a recession but actually a depression. And I think recently I wrote an article on the on Channel News Asia on that. We need a new deal coming up. And I think if you look at the Singapore case, many of the ways in which we help business have now taken on very fundamental changes. In fact, in many countries, you can see almost semblance of transformation into welfare states. And in fact, many governments are directly involved in industry, even in unemployment benefits and public works as well. So I believe many of these inevitable, but I believe all this definitely, in my view, cannot be something that's long term. I believe you have to look at how effective this is. This COVID-19 will come and it will go. I believe the vaccine will come. Of course, there are many 100 over vaccines now in racing to be effective, and the claims are anything from half a year to 2 years. So I believe this river blip will come and go. So basically, we need to be sustainable in some of the support we give government. Just like we should use this chance to encourage companies to transform, to innovate. In fact, every one of us, including myself, are now digitalizing. It's long overdue, but it's the first time I'm using the computers, and now I actually believe that how come for all these years I've been flying around and going to classes and going to meet companies, actually I could just do it through digital means. So I believe many of these new incentives have to be game changing, not so much just feeding the fish to satisfy one meal, but to change the whole mindset about how companies can go forward to innovate and transform to long-term productivity and effectiveness.
So I guess it's the last question, so I'll be very quick. I think in terms of the scale of response required because of the scale of crisis that governments have been dealing with, the first thing I note is that policymakers have risen above the traditional divide between left-wing and right-wing politics. I mean, who would have guessed in the UK, for example, 3 or 4 months ago, when the Conservative Party won a landslide victory recently, the finance minister, effectively, a former Goldman Sachs executive, gets up in Parliament and says, for the first time in history, our government is going to pay people's wages. And you have the national head of the trade union movement congratulating the Chancellor for that. That kind of constructive cross-party engagement, very pragmatic, is good to see. And in many ways, I've written about it before, that Singapore has that weird mix, if you like, between free markets and highly interventionist policies all at the same time. I was looking at NUS Business School. You guys have the some summer modules that you offer, and the cost of doing that, I was looking at how much it would cost me to do one of those courses, and it's some $3,000 something. But if you're a Singaporean, it's between $200 and $300 because you have mid-career enhanced subsidies and workfare training support and all of that, which if you do the same course in the UK and elsewhere, the university says you can speak to your employer to see if they will pay for it. So this attitude towards skills development in transition through a crisis so that you can come out on the other side in a reshaped economy, that is an approach, that is an attitude that not everyone has taken so far. But I think we're going there. All of these taboos, political taboos, are now being broken. And also cash transfers. You get a mobile on the phone, you get a message saying, $300 has been delivered to your account. That sort of cash transfers in a much more of a generalized manner. Some would argue a finite form of universal basic income we're now seeing in Japan, Canada, even in the US, you would argue, so in places where it would have been unthinkable in the past. So, extraordinary times, and I'm sure we can talk about this again in future, but I'll stop here and you have the last word, Professor Lowe.
Should we just take one more last question? I think we still have 1 more minute, because there's one very tough question that I think we should not avoid. Because, as I say, everything in the process can be asked. So I will read the question. And this seems most of us are in Singapore. How would you evaluate Singapore in this institutional structure in handling the pandemic? How can we overcome our short-sightedness? I think it's a very, very fair question. And I believe, if I can say a few sentences, I believe, in this pandemic, all the more we believe governance, and in particular, a multi-stakeholder approach is very, very important in handling any problem, whether it's corporate, whether it's investment, economy, or whether it's social political. I believe governance is really at the heart of it also. So in this multi-stakeholder approach in handling the problems of the pandemic, particularly in certain populations like the migrant workers, I believe this is a multi-stakeholder approach. So I believe, and I like to quote the S that, Lutfey has said, we need a certain stewardship approach, as well as the other S besides stakeholder and stewardship is this shared responsibility, so that the 3 S will overcome the last S, which is short-sightedness. Okay?
Yeah, I have nothing more to add, sir. I think we're being asked to wrap up.
Okay, so I think let me just wrap up. I think Lutfey started, so let me have just last say, and the last say, the organizer want me to give an advertisement of the next session. Tune in this Wednesday, same time, same place, when we discuss how COVID-19 is transforming marketing strategies. And we have 2 speakers, Professor Ang Swee Hoon from our marketing department in NUS Business School, together with manager leader outside, Mr. Ronnie Theo, managing director for marketing, and he's in charge of beer for Fraser and me. So please come back on Wednesday, same time, same place, tune in. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, everybody, for your attendance. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.